Hello again, and welcome to this segment of this week's presentation for Politics of Southeast Europe. We're talking about social change, and in this section I want to talk about economic change, especially economic changes that have followed the beginning of the rapid integration of the states of the region with European markets, starting in the 1990s and really getting off the ground around 2000. And a note that I can make is that in the period after 2000, the expectation was at the beginning that integration with the economic flows and standards of Europe in the region would bring stability and would bring prosperity. But this expectation came into collision with some problems, in particular problems faced by the core of Europe. These problems included some level of political inconsistency and lack of predictability of the process of integration and accession, and also from 2008 on, a general economic crisis, which is still continuing. In talking about the dimensions of this problem, I want to draw on the research by Besnik Pula. Besnik Pula is an economic sociologist looking at the social and economic consequences, especially of the interaction of states with large economic structures and the effects that these have on labor, on politics, on social life. Now, in his research, Besnik Pula makes the argument that we can think of the states of Southeast Europe as constituting a kind of super periphery. That is, they are on the periphery of the economic life of Europe, but placed there in a way that means that their experience of economic problems and difficulties faced by all of Europe is experienced more intensively than in the core of Europe. Okay, so financial crisis affects the core states of Europe in ways that are familiar to all of us. Some of these ways include the deepening of political division and increase in insecurity, and there are transmission belts of crisis. Disturbances in the core have effects that are felt in the periphery sometimes more strongly than they're felt in the core. And the losses that are experienced in the periphery are more severe when levels of dependency of the periphery on the core are high. They are magnified by the increasingly tight integration of markets that occur under conditions of globalization. Why is this the case? Well, it's principally because there are changes in the flows of investment and of aid, and the export markets of the peripheral states are sensitive to changes in the economies of the core states, and the prices of commodities in peripheral states are sensitive to changes in the core states. So sometimes this correspondence is indirect. That is, it leads to changes in economic conditions generally in the peripheral states that are affected, and sometimes the consequences that are felt are direct, especially in states where a large proportion of the population is dependent for their income on remittances from family members working in other states, especially states in the European core. This is especially the case in states like Albania and like Kosovo. So there's a bit of an ironic element to this relationship here. That is that all of the states have pursued the goal as much as they could in the last 2 decades of economic integration with Europe. And as it turns out, the more integrated an economy is into the European economic system, the more severely it suffers from problems in the European economic system. One of the things that this means is that states like Croatia, Slovenia, to a lesser degree Serbia, experience the consequences of economic dislocation more severely than states that are less integrated, like Macedonia, like Albania, like Kosovo, like Bosnia and Herzegovina. How are these consequences felt? Well, the strongest effects are in terms of loss of foreign investment, loss of income coming both from investment, from aid, from other forms of trade, and is also experienced in terms of increases in commodity prices, in particular prices for items like food. That is, prices of items where the price affects the security and well-being of families and households. In the economies in the region, one of the responses to this is usually the production of and higher rates of inflation. And this is partly compensated by increases in wages, by wage growth. But there's a problem here. In order to be sustainable, growth in wages requires increasing international income. Wage growth cannot be financed only from domestic income. So how do small states respond? How do states in the periphery respond? Well, one thing that they might seek to do is to decrease their exposure, to slow down processes of integration, to try to rely more on domestic or on regional markets for the exchange of their goods. And another way might be to try to diversify the economic relations of which they are able to make use, which explains in part the rise of actors from outside of Europe in importance in their roles in economies in the region. And this includes actors like Turkey, like Russia, like China, like the states of the Arabian Gulf, and so on. So what can we say then? I mean, the effects that we have talked about so far are mostly economic effects. What can we say about socio-political effects? Here are probably some of the main conclusions we could draw about political consequences of economic crisis. The first is that to the degree that economic difficulty that is faced by citizens in their day-to-day life is greater, this is going to undermine the perceived legitimacy and the actual stability, if not the perceived stability, of new states and new regimes. The second point I would make, and this is a point that we have made earlier in these presentations and discussions, is that it underlines the basic contradiction at the heart of liberalization, which is that liberalization on the one hand promotes democratic laws and structures and procedures, that is, it promotes democratic forms of politics, but at the same time it promotes anti-democratic outcomes in the areas of the society and of the economy. So there is this basic contradiction at the heart of the process, which is experienced as difficulty in the everyday lives of citizens.